To my loving family, for supporting me and reminding me that leaving the house every once in a while is a good thing. To my understanding girlfriend, for not leaving me when the stress of endless revision made me frothy and monstrous. To my sweet baby, for loving his daddy even though I have to go away and write all the time, even when we're having a really great time, even when we're talking about ducks. Prologue. A silence of 3 parts. Dawn was coming. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of 3 parts. The most obvious part was a vast, echoing quiet made by things that were lacking. If there had been a storm, raindrops would have tapped and pattered against the celis vines behind the inn. Thunder would have muttered and rumbled and chased the silence down the road like fallen autumn leaves. If there had been travelers stirring in their rooms, they would have stretched and grumbled the silence away like fraying, half-forgotten dreams. If there had been music... But no. Of course there was no music. In fact, there were none of these things. And so the silence remained. Inside the Waystone, a dark-haired man eased the back door closed behind himself. Moving through the perfect dark, he crept through the kitchen, across the tap room, and down the basement stairs. With the ease of long experience, he avoided loose boards that might groan or sigh beneath his weight. Each slow step made only the barest tap against the floor. In doing this, he added his small, furtive silence to the larger, echoing one. They made an amalgam of sorts, a counterpoint. The third silence was not an easy thing to notice. If you listened long enough, you might begin to feel it in the chill of the window glass and the smooth plaster walls of the innkeeper's room. It was in the dark chest that lay at the foot of a hard and narrow bed. And it was in the hands of the man who lay there, motionless, watching for the first pale hint of dawn's coming light. The man had true red hair, red as flame. His eyes were dark and distant, and he lay with the resigned air of one who has long ago abandoned any hope of sleep. The Waystone was his, just as the third silence was his. This was appropriate, as it was the greatest silence of the 3, holding the others inside itself. It was deep and wide as autumn's ending. It was heavy as a great river-smooth stone. It was the patient, cut-flower sound of a man who is waiting to die. Chapter 1. Apple and Elderberry. Bast slouched against the long stretch of mahogany bar, bored. Looking around the empty room, he sighed and rummaged around until he found a clean linen cloth. Then, with a resigned look, he began to polish a section of the bar. After a moment, Bast leaned forward and squinted at some half-seen speck. He scratched at it and frowned at the oily smudge his finger made. He leaned closer, fogged the bar with his breath, and buffed it briskly. Then he paused, exhaled hard against the wood, and wrote an obscene word in the fog. Tossing aside the cloth, Bast made his way through the empty tables and chairs to the wide windows of the inn. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the dirt road running through the center of the town. Bast gave another sigh and began to pace the room. He moved with the casual grace of a dancer and the perfect nonchalance of a cat. But when he ran his hands through his dark hair, the gesture was restless. His blue eyes prowled the room endlessly, as if searching for a way out, as if searching for something he hadn't seen 100 times before. But there was nothing new. Empty tables and chairs. Empty stools at the bar. 2 huge barrels loomed on the counter behind the bar, one for whiskey, one for beer. Between the barrels stood a vast panoply of bottles, all colors and shapes. Above the bottles hung a sword. Bast's eyes fell back onto the bottles. He focused on them for a long, speculative moment, then moved back behind the bar and brought out a heavy clay mug. Drawing a deep breath, he pointed a finger at the first bottle in the bottom row and began to chant as he counted down the line. Maple, maple, catch and carry, ash and ember, elderberry. He finished the chant while pointing at a squat green bottle. He twisted out the cork, took a speculative sip, then made a sour face and shuddered. He quickly set the bottle down and picked up a curving red one instead. He sipped this one as well, rubbed his wet lips together thoughtfully, then nodded and splashed a generous portion into his mug. He pointed at the next bottle and started counting again. Woolen woman, moon at night, willow, window, candlelight. This time, it was a clear bottle with a pale yellow liquor inside. Bast yanked the cork and added a long pour to the mug without bothering to taste it first. Setting the bottle aside, he picked up the mug and swirled it dramatically before taking a mouthful. He smiled a brilliant smile and flicked the new bottle with his finger, making it chime lightly before he began his sing-song chant again. Barrel, barley, stone and stave, wind and water. A floorboard creaked, and Bast looked up, smiling brightly. Good morning, Reshi. The red-haired innkeeper stood at the bottom of the stairs. He brushed his long-fingered hands over the clean apron and full-length sleeves he wore. Is our guest awake yet? Bast shook his head. Not a rustle or a peep. He's had a hard couple of days, Coat said. It's probably catching up with him. He hesitated, then lifted his head and sniffed. Have you been drinking? The question was more curious than accusatory. No, Bast said. The innkeeper raised an eyebrow. I've been tasting, Bast said, emphasizing the word. Tasting comes before drinking. Ah, the innkeeper said. So you were getting ready to drink then? Tiny gods, yes, Bast said. To great excess. What the hell else is there to do? Bast brought his mug up from underneath the bar and looked into it. I was hoping for elderberry, but I got some sort of melon. He swirled the mug speculatively. Plus, something spicy. He took another sip and narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. Cinnamon? He asked, looking at the ranks of bottles. Do we even have any more elderberry? It's in there somewhere, the innkeeper said, not bothering to look at the bottles. Stop a moment and listen, Bast. We need to talk about what you did last night. Bast went very still. What did I do, Reshi? You stopped that creature from the mail, Coat said. Oh! Bast relaxed, making a dismissive gesture. I just slowed it down, Reshi, that's all. Coat shook his head. You realized it wasn't just some madman. You tried to warn us. If you hadn't been so quick on your feet. Bast frowned. I wasn't so quick, Reshi. It got Shep. He looked down at the well-scrubbed floorboards near the bar. I liked Shep. Everyone else will think the smith's prentice saved us, Coat said, and that's probably for the best. But I know the truth. If not for you, it would have slaughtered everyone here. Oh, Reshi, that's just not true, Bast said. You would have killed it like a chicken. I just got it first. The innkeeper shrugged the comment away. Last night has me thinking, he said. Wondering what we could do to make things a bit safer around here. Have you ever heard the White Riders Hunt? Bast smiled. It was our song before it was yours, Reshi. He drew a breath and sang in a sweet tenor. Rode they horses white as snow, silver blade and white horn bow, wore they fresh and supple boughs, red and green upon their brows. The innkeeper nodded. Exactly the verse I was thinking of. Do you think you could take care of it while I get things ready here? Bast nodded enthusiastically and practically bolted, pausing by the kitchen door. You won't start without me? He asked anxiously. We'll start as soon as our guest is fed and ready, Coat said. Then, seeing the expression on his student's face, he relented a little. For all that, I imagine you have an hour or two. Bast glanced through the doorway, then back. Amusement flickered over the innkeeper's face. "And I'll call before we start." He made a shooing motion with one hand. "Go on now." The man, who called himself Coat, went through his usual routine at the Waystone Inn. He moved like clockwork, like a wagon rolling down the road in well-worn ruts. First came the bread. He mixed flour and sugar and salt with his hands, not bothering to measure. He added a piece of starter from the clay jar in the pantry, kneaded the dough, then rounded the loaves and set them to rise. He shoveled ash from the stove in the kitchen and kindled a fire. Next, he moved into the common room and laid a fire in the black stone fireplace, brushing the ash from the massive hearth along the northern wall. He pumped water, washed his hands, and brought up a piece of mutton from the basement. He cut fresh kindling, carried in firewood, punched down the rising bread, and moved it close to the now warm stove. And then, abruptly, there was nothing left to do. Everything was ready. Everything was clean and orderly. The red-haired man stood behind the bar, his eyes slowly returning from their faraway place, focusing on the here and now, on the inn itself. They came to rest on the sword that hung on the wall above the bottles. It wasn't a particularly beautiful sword, not ornate or eye-catching. It was menacing in a way. The same way a tall cliff is menacing. It was gray and unblemished and cold to the touch. It was sharp as shattered glass. Carved into the black wood of the mounting board was a single word: folly. The innkeeper heard heavy footsteps on the wooden landing outside. The door's latch rattled noisily, followed by a loud "Hello!" and a thumping on the door. "Just a moment," Coat called. Hurrying to the front door, he turned the heavy key in the door's bright brass lock. Graham stood with his thick hand poised to knock on the door. His weathered face split into a grin when he saw the innkeeper. "Bast open things up for you again this morning?" he asked. Coat gave a tolerant smile. "He's a good boy," Graham said. "Just a little dither-headed. I thought you might have closed up shop today." He cleared his throat and glanced at his feet for a moment. "I wouldn't be surprised, considering." Coat put the key in his pocket. "Open as always. What can I do for you?" Graham stepped out of the doorway and nodded toward the street where 3 barrels stood in a nearby cart. They were new, with pale, polished wood and bright metal bands. "I knew I wasn't getting any sleep last night, so I knocked the last one together for you. Besides, I heard the Bentons would be coming round with the first of the late apples today." "I appreciate that." "Nice and tight so they'll keep through the winter." Graham walked over and rapped a knuckle proudly against the side of the barrel. "Nothing like a winter apple to stave off hunger." He looked up with a glimmer in his eye and knocked at the side of the barrel again. "Get it? Stave?" Coat groaned a bit, rubbing at his face. Graham chuckled to himself and ran a hand over one of the barrel's bright metal bands. "I ain't never made a barrel with brass before, but these turned out nice as I could hope for. You let me know if they don't stay tight. I'll see to 'em." "I'm glad it wasn't too much trouble," the innkeeper said. "The cellar gets damp. I worry iron would just rust out in a couple years." Graham nodded. "That's right sensible," he said. "Not many folk take the long view of things." He rubbed his hands together. "Would you like to give me a hand? I'd hate to drop one and scuff your floors." They set to it. 2 of the brass-bound barrels went to the basement, while the 3rd was maneuvered behind the bar, through the kitchen, and into the pantry. After that, the men made their way back to the common room, each on their own side of the bar. There was a moment of silence as Graham looked around the empty tap room. There were 2 fewer stools than there should be at the bar, and an empty space left by an absent table. In the orderly tap room, these things were conspicuous as missing teeth. Graham pulled his eyes from a well-scrubbed piece of floor near the bar. He reached into his pocket and brought out a pair of dull iron shims, his hand hardly shaking at all. "Bring me up a short beer, would you, Coat?" he asked, his voice rough. "I know it's early, but I've got a long day ahead of me. I'm helping the Murians bring their wheat in." The innkeeper drew the beer and handed it over silently. Graham drank half of it off in a long swallow. His eyes were red around the edges. "Bad business last night," he said without making eye contact, then took another drink. Coat nodded. Bad business last night. Chances are, that would be all Graham had to say about the death of a man he had known his whole life. These folk knew all about death. They killed their own livestock. They died from fevers, falls, or broken bones gone sour. Death was like an unpleasant neighbor. You didn't talk about him, for fear he might hear you and decide to pay a visit. Except for stories, of course. Tales of poisoned kings and duels and old wars were fine. They dressed death in foreign clothes and sent him far from your door. A chimney fire or the croup cough were terrifying. But Gibeah's trial or the siege of Enfast, those were different. They were like prayers, like charms muttered late at night when you were walking alone in the dark. Stories were like halfpenny amulets you bought from a peddler, just in case. "How long is that scribe fellow going to be around?" Graham asked after a moment, voice echoing in his mug. "Maybe I should get a bit of something writ up, just in case." He frowned a bit. "My daddy always called them laying down papers. Can't remember what they're really called." "If it's just your goods that need looking after, it's a disposition of property," the innkeeper said matter-of-factly. "If it relates to other things, it's called a mandamus of declared will." Graham lifted an eyebrow at the innkeeper. "What I heard, at any rate," the innkeeper said, looking down and rubbing the bar with a clean white cloth. "Scribe mentioned something along those lines." "Mandamus," Graham murmured into his mug. "I reckon I'll just ask him for some laying down papers, and let him official it up however he likes." He looked up at the innkeeper. "Other folk will probably be wanting something similar, times being what they are." For a moment, it looked like the innkeeper frowned with irritation. But no, he did nothing of the sort. Standing behind the bar, he looked the same as he always did, his expression placid and agreeable. He gave an easy nod. "He mentioned he'd be setting up shop around midday," Coat said. "He was a bit unsettled by everything last night. If anyone shows up earlier than noon, I expect they'll be disappointed." Graham shrugged. "Shouldn't make any difference. There won't be but 10 people in the whole town until lunchtime anyway." He took another swallow of beer and looked out the window. "Today's a field day, and that's for sure." The innkeeper seemed to relax a bit. "He'll be here tomorrow, too, so there's no need for everyone to rush in today. Folks stole his horse off by Abbotsford. He's trying to find a new one." Graham sucked his teeth sympathetically. "Poor bastard. He won't find a horse for love nor money with harvest in mid-swing. Even Carter couldn't replace Nellie after that spider thing attacked him off by the old stone bridge." He shook his head. "It doesn't seem right. Something like that happening not 2 miles from your own door. Back when..." Graham stopped. "Lord and lady, sound like my old da." He tucked in his chin and added some gruff to his voice. "Back when I was a boy, we had proper weather. The miller kept his thumb off the scale and folk knew to look after their own business." The innkeeper's face grew a wistful smile. "My father said the beer was better, and the roads had fewer ruts." Graham smiled, but it faded quickly. He looked down, as if uncomfortable with what he was about to say. I know you aren't from around here, Coat. That's a hard thing. Some folk think a stranger can't hardly know the time of day. He drew a deep breath, still not meeting the innkeeper's eyes. But I figure you know things other folk don't. You've got sort of a wider view. He looked up, his eyes serious and weary, dark around the edges from lack of sleep. Are things as grim as they seem lately? The roads so bad, folk getting robbed, and... With an obvious effort, Graham kept himself from looking at the empty piece of floor again. All the new taxes making things so tight. The Graydon boys about to lose their farm. That spider thing. He took another swallow of beer. Are things as bad as they seem? Or have I just gotten old, like my da, and now everything tastes a little bitter compared to when I was a boy? Coat wiped at the bar for a long moment, as if reluctant to speak. I think things are usually bad one way or another, he said. It might be that only us older folk can see it. Graham began to nod, then frowned. Except, you're not old, are you? I forget that most times. He looked the red-haired man up and down. I mean, you move around old and you talk old, but you're not, are you? I'll bet you're half my age. He squinted at the innkeeper. How old are you, anyway? The innkeeper gave a tired smile. Old enough to feel old. Graham snorted. Too young to make old man noises. You should be out chasing women and getting into trouble. Leave us old folk to complain about how the world is getting all loose in the joints. The old carpenter pushed himself away from the bar and turned to walk toward the door. I'll be back to talk to your scribe when we break for lunch today. I ain't the only one either. There's a lot of folks that'll want to get some things set down official when they've got the chance. The innkeeper drew a deep breath and let it out slowly. Graham? The man turned with one hand on the door. It's not just you, Coat said. Things are bad, and my gut tells me they'll get worse yet. It wouldn't hurt a man to get ready for a hard winter, and maybe see that he can defend himself if need be. The innkeeper shrugged. That's what my gut tells me, anyway. Graham's mouth set into a grim line. He bobbed his head once in a serious nod. I'm glad it's not just my gut, I suppose. Then he forced a grin and began to cuff up his shirt sleeves as he turned to the door. Still, he said, you've got to make hay while the sun shines. Not long after that, the Bentons stopped by with a cartload of late apples. The innkeeper bought half of what they had and spent the next hour sorting and storing them. The greenest and firmest went into the barrels in the basement, his gentle hands laying them carefully in place and packing them in sawdust before hammering down the lids. Those closer to full ripe went to the pantry, and any with a bruise or spot of brown were doomed to be cider apples, quartered and tossed into a large tin washtub. As he sorted and packed, the red-haired man seemed content. But if you looked more closely, you might have noticed that while his hands were busy, his eyes were far away. And while his expression was composed, pleasant even, there was no joy in it. He did not hum or whistle while he worked. He did not sing. When the last of the apples were sorted, he carried the metal tub through the kitchen and out the back door. It was a cool autumn morning, and behind the inn was a small private garden sheltered by trees. Coat tumbled a load of quartered apples into the wooden cider press and spun the top down until it no longer moved easily. Coat cuffed up the long sleeves of his shirt past his elbows, then gripped the handles of the press with his long, graceful hands and pulled. The press screwed down, first packing the apples tight, then crushing them. Twist and regrip. Twist and regrip. If there had been anyone to see, they would have noticed his arms weren't the doughy arms of an innkeeper. When he pulled against the wooden handles, the muscles of his forearms stood out, tight as twisted ropes. Old scars crossed and recrossed his skin. Most were pale and thin as cracks in winter ice. Others were red and angry, standing out against his fair complexion. The innkeeper's hands gripped and pulled. The only sounds were the rhythmic creak of the wood and the slow patter of the cider as it ran into the bucket below. There was a rhythm to it, but no music, and the innkeeper's eyes were distant and joyless, so pale a green they almost could have passed for gray. Chapter 2. Holly. Chronicler reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped into the Waystones' common room with his flat leather satchel over one shoulder. Stopping in the doorway, he eyed the red-haired innkeeper hunched intently over something on the bar. Chronicler cleared his throat as he stepped into the room. "I'm sorry to have slept so late," he said. "It's not really—" He stalled out when he saw what was on the bar. "Are you making a pie?" Coat looked up from crimping the edge of the crust with his fingers. "Pies," he said, stressing the plural. "Yes. Why?" Chronicler opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes flickered to the sword that hung gray and silent behind the bar, then back to the red-haired man carefully pinching crust around the edge of a pan. "What kind of pie?" "Apple." Coat straightened and cut 3 careful slits into the crust covering the pie. "Do you know how difficult it is to make a good pie?" "Not really," Chronicler admitted, then looked around nervously. "Where's your assistant?" "God himself can only guess at such things," the innkeeper said. "It's quite hard. Making pies, I mean. You wouldn't think it, but there's quite a lot to the process. Bread is easy. Soup is easy. Pudding is easy. But pie is complicated. It's something you never realize until you try it for yourself." Chronicler nodded in vague agreement, looking uncertain as to what else might be expected of him. He shrugged the satchel off his shoulder and set it on a nearby table. Coat wiped his hands on his apron. "When you press apples for cider, you know the pulp that's left over?" "The pomace?" "Pomace!" Coat said with profound relief. "That's what it's called. What do people do with it after they get the juice out?" "Grape pomace can make a weak wine," Chronicler said. "Or oil if you've got a lot, but apple pomace is pretty useless. You can use it as fertilizer or mulch, but it's not much good as either. Folk feed it to their livestock mostly." Coat nodded, looking thoughtful. It didn't seem like they'd just throw it out. They put everything to use one way or another around here. Pomace. He spoke as if he were tasting the word. "It's been bothering me for 2 years now." Chronicler looked puzzled. "Anyone in town could have told you that." The innkeeper frowned. "If it's something everyone knows, I can't afford to ask," he said. There was the sound of a door banging closed, followed by a bright, wandering whistle. Bast emerged from the kitchen carrying a bristling armload of holly boughs wrapped in a white sheet. Coat nodded grimly and rubbed his hands together. "Lovely. Now, how do we—" His eyes narrowed. "Are those my good sheets?" Bast looked down at the bundle. "Well, Reshi," he said slowly, "that depends. Do you have any bad sheets?" The innkeeper's eyes flashed angrily for a second. Then he sighed. "It doesn't matter, I suppose." He reached over and pulled a single long branch from the bundle. "What do we do with this, anyway?" Bast shrugged. "I'm running dark on this myself, Reshi. I know the Sith used to ride out wearing holly crowns when they hunted the skin dancers." We can't walk around wearing holly crowns, Coat said dismissively. Folk would talk. I don't care what the local plods think, Bast murmured as he began to weave several long, flexible branches together. When a dancer gets inside your body, you're like a puppet. It can make you bite out your own tongue. He lifted a half-formed circle up to his own head, checking the fit. He wrinkled his nose. Prickly. In the stories I've heard, Coat said, Holly traps them in a body too. Couldn't we just wear iron? Chronicler asked. The two men behind the bar looked at him curiously, as if they'd almost forgotten he was there. I mean, if it's a failing creature— Don't say failing, Bast said disparagingly. It makes you sound like a child. It's a fey creature. Feign if you must. Chronicler hesitated for a moment before continuing. If this thing slid into the body of someone wearing iron, wouldn't that hurt it? Wouldn't it just jump out again? They can make you bite out your own tongue, Bast repeated, as if speaking to a particularly stupid child. Once they're in you, they'll use your hand to pull out your own eye as easy as you'd pick a daisy. What makes you think they couldn't take the time to remove a bracelet or a ring? He shook his head, looking down as he worked another bright green branch of holly into the circle he held. Besides, I'll be damned if I'm wearing iron. If they can jump out of bodies, Chronicler said, why didn't it just leave that man's body last night? Why didn't it hop into one of us? There was a long, quiet moment before Bast realized the other two men were looking at him. You're asking me? He laughed incredulously. I have no idea. Unpawn. The last of the dancers were hunted down hundreds of years ago, long before my time. I've just heard stories. Then how do we know it didn't jump out? Chronicler said slowly, as if reluctant even to ask. How do we know it isn't still here? He sat very stiffly in his seat. How do we know it's not in one of us right now? It seemed like it died when the mercenary's body died, Coat said. We would have seen it leave. He glanced over at Bast. They're supposed to look like a dark shadow or smoke when they leave the body, aren't they? Bast nodded. Plus, if it had hopped out, it would have just started killing folk with the new body. That's what they usually do. They switch and switch until everyone is dead. The innkeeper gave Chronicler a reassuring smile. See? It might not even have been a dancer. Perhaps it was just something similar. Chronicler looked a little wild around the eyes. But how can we be sure? It might be inside anyone in town right now. It might be inside me, Bast said nonchalantly. Maybe I'm just waiting for you to let your guard down, and then I'll bite you on the chest right over your heart and drink all the blood out of you, like sucking the juice out of a plum. Chronicler's mouth made a thin line. That's not funny. Bast looked up and gave Chronicler a rakish, toothy grin. But there was something slightly off about the expression. It lasted a little too long. The grin was slightly too wide. His eyes were focused slightly to one side of the scribe, rather than directly on him. Bast went still for a moment, his fingers no longer weaving nimbly among the green leaves. He looked down at his hands curiously, then dropped the half-finished circle of holly onto the bar. His grin slowly faded to a blank expression, and he looked around the tap room dully. Evayan? He said in a strange voice, his eyes glassy and confused. Tantan? Bentelanet? Then, moving with startling speed, Bast lunged from behind the bar toward Chronicler. The scribe exploded out of his seat, bolting madly away. He upset 2 tables and a half-dozen chairs before his feet got tangled and he tumbled messily to the floor, arms and legs flailing as he clawed his way frantically toward the door. As he scrambled wildly, Chronicler darted a quick look over his shoulder, his face horrified and pale, only to see that Bast hadn't taken more than 3 steps. The dark-haired young man stood next to the bar, bent nearly double and shaking with helpless laughter. One hand half covered his face, while the other pointed at Chronicler. He was laughing so hard he could barely draw a breath. After a moment, he had to reach out and steady himself against the bar. Chronicler was livid. "You ass!" he shouted as he climbed painfully to his feet. You ass!" Still laughing too hard to breathe, Bass raised his hands and made weak, half-hearted clawing gestures, like a child pretending to be a bear. "Bast," the innkeeper chided. "Come now. Really." But while Coates' voice was stern, his eyes were bright with laughter. His lips twitched, struggling not to curl. Moving with affronted dignity, Chronicler busied himself setting the tables and chairs to rights, thumping them down rather harder than he needed to. When at last he returned to his original table, he sat down stiffly. By then, Bast had returned to stand behind the bar, breathing hard and pointedly focusing on the holly in his hands. Chronicler glared at him and rubbed his shin. Bast stifled something that could conceivably have been a cough. Coat chuckled low in his throat and pulled another length of holly from the bundle, adding it to the long cord he was making. He looked up to catch Chronicler's eye. "Before I forget to mention it, folk will be stopping by today to take advantage of your services as a scribe." Chronicler seemed surprised. "Will they now?" Coat nodded and gave an irritated sigh. "Yes. The news is already out, so it can't be helped. We'll have to deal with them as they come. Luckily, everyone with two good hands will be busy in the fields until midday, so we won't have to worry about it until—" The innkeeper's fingers fumbled clumsily, snapping the holly branch and jabbing a thorn deep into the fleshy part of his thumb. The red-haired man didn't flinch or curse, just scowled angrily down at his hand as a bead of blood welled up, bright as a berry. Frowning, the innkeeper brought his thumb to his mouth. All the laughter faded from his expression, and his eyes were hard and dark. He tossed the half-finished holly cord aside in a gesture so pointedly casual it was almost frightening. He looked back to Chronicler, his voice perfectly calm. "My point is that we should make good use of our time before we're interrupted," he said. "But first, I imagine you'll want some breakfast." "If it wouldn't be too much trouble," Chronicler said. "None at all," Coat said as he turned and headed into the kitchen. Bast watched him leave, a concerned expression on his face. "You'll want to pull the cider off the stove and set it to cool out back," Bast called out to him loudly. "The last batch was closer to jam than juice. And I found some herbs while I was out, too. They're on the rain barrel. You should look them over to see if they'll be any use for supper." Left alone in the taproom, Bast and Chronicler watched each other across the bar for a long moment. The only sound was the distant thump of the back door closing. Bast made a final adjustment to the crown in his hands, looking it over from all angles. He brought it up to his face as if to smell it, but instead, he drew a deep lungful of air, closed his eyes, and breathed out against the holly leaves so gently they barely moved. Opening his eyes, Bast gave a charming, apologetic smile and walked over to Chronicler. "Here." He held out the circle of holly to the seated man. Chronicler made no move to take it. Bast's smile didn't fade. "You didn't notice because you were busy falling down," he said, his voice pitched low and quiet. "But he actually laughed when you bolted. 3 good laughs from down in his belly. He has such a wonderful laugh. It's like fruit, like music. I haven't heard it in months." Bast held the circle of holly out again, smiling shyly. "So this is for you. I've brought what gramarye I have to bear on it, so it will stay green and living longer than you'd think. I gathered the holly in the proper way and shaped it with my own hands, sought, wrought, and moved to purpose." He held it out a bit farther, like a nervous boy with a bouquet. "Here. It is a freely given gift. I offer it without obligation, let or lien. Hesitantly, Chronicler reached out and took the crown. He looked it over, turning it in his hands. Red berries nestled in the dark green leaves like gems, and it was cunningly braided so the thorns angled outward. He set it gingerly on his head, and it fit snugly across his brow. Bast grinned. "All hail the Lord of Misrule!" he shouted, throwing up his hands. He laughed a delighted laugh. A smile tugged Chronicler's lips as he removed the crown. "So," he said softly, as he lowered his hands into his lap, "does this mean things are settled between us?" Bast tilted his head, puzzled. "Beg pardon?" Chronicler looked uncomfortable. "What you spoke of last night." Bast looked surprised. "Oh, no," he said seriously, shaking his head. "No, not at all. You belong to me, down to the marrow of your bones. You are an instrument of my desire." Bast darted a glance toward the kitchen, his expression turning bitter. "And you know what I desire. Make him remember he's more than some innkeeper baking pies." He practically spat the last word. Chronicler shifted uneasily in his seat, looking away. "I still don't know what I can do." "You'll do whatever you can," Bast said, his voice low. "You will draw him out of himself. You will wake him up." He said the last words fiercely. Bast lay one hand on Chronicler's shoulder, his blue eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "You will make him remember. You will." Chronicler hesitated for a moment, then looked down at the circle of holly in his lap and gave a small nod. "I'll do what I can." "That's all any of us can do," Bast said, giving him a friendly pat on the back. "How's the shoulder, by the way?" The scribe rolled it around, the motion seeming out of place as the rest of his body remained stiff and still. "Numb? Chilly? But it doesn't hurt." "That's to be expected. I wouldn't worry about it if I were you." Bast smiled at him encouragingly. "Life's too short for you folk to fret over little things." Breakfast came and went. Potatoes, toast, tomatoes, and eggs. Chronicler tucked away a respectable portion, and Bast ate enough for 3 people. Coat puttered about, bringing in more firewood, stoking the oven in preparation for the pies, and jugging up the cooling cider. He was carrying a pair of jugs to the bar when boots sounded on the wooden landing outside the inn, loud as any knocking. A moment later, the smith's apprentice burst through the door. Barely 16, he was one of the tallest men in town, with broad shoulders and thick arms. "Hello, Aaron," the innkeeper said calmly. "Close the door, would you? It's dusty out." As the smith's apprentice turned back to the door, the innkeeper and Bast tucked most of the holly below the bar, moving in quick, unspoken concert. By the time the smith's apprentice turned back to face them, Bast was toying with something that could easily have been a small, half-finished wreath, something made to keep the idle fingers busy against boredom. Aaron didn't seem to notice anything different as he hurried up to the bar. "Mr. Coat," he said excitedly, "could I get some traveling food?" He waved an empty burlap sack. "Carter said you'd know what that meant." The innkeeper nodded. "I've got some bread and cheese, sausage and apples." He gestured to Bast, who grabbed the sack and scampered off into the kitchen. "Carter's going somewhere today?" "Him and me both," the boy said. "The Orsons are selling some mutton off in Treya today. They hired me and Carter to come along, on account of the roads being so bad and all." "Treya?" the innkeeper mused. "You won't be back till tomorrow, then." The smith's apprentice carefully set a slim silver bit on the polished mahogany of the bar. "Carter's hoping to find a replacement for Nellie, too, but if he can't come by a horse, he said he'll probably take the king's coin." Coat's eyebrows went up. "Carter's going to enlist?" The boy gave a smile that was a strange mix of grin and grim. He says there ain't much else for him if he can't come by a horse for his cart. He says they take care of you in the army. You get fed and get to travel around and such. The young man's eyes were excited as he spoke, his expression trapped somewhere between a boy's enthusiasm and the serious worry of a man. And they ain't just giving folks a silver noble for listing up anymore. These days, they hand you over a royal when you sign up. A whole gold royal. The innkeeper's expression grew somber. Carter's the only one thinking about taking the coin, right? He looked the boy in the eye. Royal's a lot of money, the smith's apprentice admitted, flashing a sly grin. And times are tight since my dad passed and my mom moved over from Ranish. And what does your mother think of you taking the king's coin? The boy's face fell. Oh, don't go taking her side, he complained. I thought you'd understand. You're a man. You know how a fella has to do right by his mom. I know your mom would rather have you home safe than swim in a tub of gold, boy. I'm tired of folk calling me boy, the smith's apprentice snapped, his face flushing. I can do some good in the army. Once we get the rebels to swear fealty to the penitent king, things will start getting better again. The levy taxes will stop, the Bentleys won't lose their land, the roads will be safe again. Then his expression went grim, and for a second, his face didn't seem very young at all. And then my mom won't have to sit all anxious when I'm not at home, he said, his voice dark. She'll stop waking up 3 times a night, checking the window shutters and the bar on the door. Aaron met the innkeeper's eye, and his back straightened. When he stopped slouching, he was almost a full head taller than the innkeeper. Sometimes, a man has to stand up for his king and his country. And Rose? The innkeeper asked quietly. The apprentice blushed and looked down in embarrassment. His shoulders slouched again, and he deflated like a sail when the wind goes out of it. Lord, does everyone know about us? The innkeeper nodded with a gentle smile. No secrets in a town like this. Well, Aaron said resolutely, I'm doing this for her, too. For us. With my coin and the pay I've saved, I can buy us a house or set up my own shop without having to go to some shim moneylender. Coate opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked thoughtful for the space of a long, deep breath, then spoke as if choosing his words very carefully. Aaron, do you know who Kvothe is? The smith's apprentice rolled his eyes. I'm not an idiot. We were telling stories about him just last night, remember? He looked over the innkeeper's shoulder toward the kitchen. Look, I've got to get on my way. Carter will be mad as a wet hen if I don't... Coate made a calming gesture. I'll make you a deal, Aaron. Listen to what I have to say, and I'll let you have your food for free. He pushed the silver bit back across the bar. Then, you can use that to buy something nice for Rose and Treya. Aaron nodded cautiously. Fair enough. What do you know about Kvothe from the stories you've heard? What's he supposed to be like? Aaron laughed. Aside from dead? Coate smiled faintly. Aside from dead. He knew all sorts of secret magics, Aaron said. He knew 6 words he could whisper in a horse's ear that would make it run 100 miles. He could turn iron into gold and catch lightning in a quart jar to save it for later. He knew a song that would open any lock, and he could stave in a strong oak door with just one hand. Aaron trailed off. It all depends on the story, really. Sometimes he's the good guy, like Prince Gallant. He rescued some girls from a troop of ogres once. Another faint smile. I know. But in other stories, he's a right bastard, Aaron continued. He stole secret magics from the university. That's why they threw him out, you know. And they didn't call him Kvothe Kingkiller because he was good with a lute. The smile was gone, but the innkeeper nodded. True enough. But what was he like? Aaron's brow furrowed a bit. He had red hair, if that's what you mean. All the stories say that. A right devil with a sword. He was terrible clever. Had a real silver tongue, too. Could talk his way out of anything. The innkeeper nodded. Right. So if you were Kvothe, and terrible clever, as you say, and suddenly your head was worth 1,000 royals and a duchy to whoever cut it off, what would you do? The smith's prentice shook his head and shrugged, plainly at a loss. Well, if I were Kvothe, the innkeeper said, I'd fake my death, change my name, and find some little town out in the middle of nowhere. Then I'd open an inn and do my best to disappear. He looked at the young man. That's what I'd do. Aaron's eyes flickered to the innkeeper's red hair, to the sword that hung over the bar, then back to the innkeeper's eyes. Kote nodded slowly, then pointed to Chronicler. That fellow isn't just some ordinary scribe. He's a sort of historian, here to write down the true story of my life. You've missed the beginning, but if you'd like, you can stay for the rest. He smiled an easy smile. I can tell you stories no one has ever heard before. Stories no one will ever hear again. Stories about Felurian, how I learned to fight from the Adem. The truth about Princess Ariel. The innkeeper reached across the bar and touched the boy's arm. Truth is, Aaron, I'm fond of you. I think you're uncommon smart, and I'd hate to see you throw your life away. He took a deep breath and looked the smith's prentice full in the face. His eyes were a startling green. I know how this war started. I know the truth of it. Once you hear that, you won't be nearly so eager to run off and die fighting in the middle of it. The innkeeper gestured to one of the empty chairs at the table beside Chronicler and smiled a smile so charming and easy that it belonged on a storybook prince. What do you say? Aaron stared seriously at the innkeeper for a long moment, his eyes darting up to the sword, then back down again. If you really are... His voice trailed off, but his expression turned into a question. I really am, Kote reassured him gently. Then, can I see your cloak of no particular color? The prentice asked with a grin. The innkeeper's charming smile went stiff and brittle as a sheet of shattered glass. You're getting Kvothe confused with Taborlin the Great, Chronicler said matter-of-factly from across the room. Taborlin had the cloak of no particular color. Aaron's expression was puzzled as he turned to look at the scribe. What did Kvothe have, then? A shadow cloak, Chronicler said. If I remember correctly. The boy turned back toward the bar. Can you show me your shadow cloak, then? He asked. Or a bit of magic? I've always wanted to see some. Just a little fire or lightning would be enough. I wouldn't want to tire you out. Before the innkeeper could respond, Aaron burst into a sudden laugh. I'm just having some fun with you, Mr. Kote. He grinned again, wider than before. Lord and lady, but I ain't never heard a liar like you before in my whole life. Even my Uncle Alvin couldn't tell one like that with a straight face. The innkeeper looked down and muttered something incomprehensible. Aaron reached over the bar and lay a broad hand on Kote's shoulder. I know you're just trying to help, Mr. Kote, he said warmly. You're a good man, and I'll think about what you said. I'm not rushing out to join. I just want to give my options a look over. The smith's prentice shook his head ruefully. I swear, everyone's taking a run at me this morning. My mom said she was sick with the consumption. Rose told me she was pregnant. He ran one hand through his hair, chuckling. But yours was the ribbon winner of the lot, I've got to say. Well, you know. Kote managed a sickly smile. I couldn't have looked your mom square in the eye if I hadn't given it a shot. You might have had a chance if you'd picked something easier to swallow, he said. But everybody knows Kvothe's sword was made of silver. He flicked his eyes up to the sword that hung on the wall. It wasn't called Folly, either. It was Kaysera, the poet killer. The innkeeper rocked back a bit at that. The poet killer? Aaron nodded doggedly. Yes, sir. And your scribe there is right. He had his cloak made all out of cobwebs and shadows, and he wore rings on all his fingers. How does it go? On his first hand, he wore rings of stone, iron, amber, wood, and bone. There were... The smith's apprentice frowned. I can't remember the rest. There was something about fire. The innkeeper's expression was unreadable. He looked down at where his own hands lay spread on the top of the bar, and after a moment he recited. There were rings unseen on his second hand. One was blood in a flowing band, one of air all whisper thin, and the ring of ice had a flaw within. Full faintly shone the ring of flame, and the final ring was without name. That's it, Aaron said, smiling. You don't have any of those behind the bar, do you? He stood on his toes as if trying to get a better look. Coate gave a shaky, shame-faced smile. No. No, I can't say as I do. They both startled as Bast thumped a burlap sack onto the bar. That should take care of both Carter and you for 2 days with plenty to spare, Bast said brusquely. Aaron shouldered the sack and started to leave, then hesitated and looked back at the two of them behind the bar. I hate to ask for favors. Old Cobb said he'd look in on my mum for me, but... Bast made his way around the bar and began herding Aaron toward the door. She'll be fine, I expect. I'll stop and see Rose, too, if you like. He gave the smith's apprentice a wide, lascivious smile, just to make sure she's not lonely or anything. I'd appreciate it, Aaron said, relief plain in his voice. She was in a bit of a state when I left. She could do with some comforting. Bast stopped midway through opening the inn's door and gave the broad-shouldered boy a look of utter disbelief. Then he shook his head and finished opening the door. Right, off you go. Have fun in the big city. Don't drink the water. Bast closed the door and pressed his forehead against the wood as if suddenly weary. She could use some comforting? He repeated incredulously. I take back everything I ever said about that boy being clever. He turned around to face the bar while leveling an accusatory finger at the closed door. That, he said firmly to the room in general, is what comes of working with iron every day. The innkeeper gave a humorless chuckle as he leaned against the bar. So much for my legendary silver tongue. Bast gave a derogatory snort. The boy is an idiot, Reshi. Am I supposed to feel better because I wasn't able to persuade an idiot, Bast? Chronicler cleared his throat softly. It seems more of a testament to the performance you've given here, he said. You've played the innkeeper so well, they can't think of you any other way. He gestured around at the empty taproom. Frankly, I'm surprised you'd be willing to risk your life here just to keep the boy out of the army. Not much of a risk, the innkeeper said. It's not much of a life. He hauled himself upright and walked around to the front of the bar, making his way to the table where Chronicler sat. I'm responsible for everyone who dies in this stupid war. I was just hoping to save one. Apparently, even that is beyond me. He sank into the chair opposite Chronicler. Where did we leave off yesterday? No sense repeating myself if I can help it. You'd just called the wind and given Ambrose a piece of what he had coming to him, Bast said from where he stood at the door. And you were mooning over your lady love something fierce. Coate looked up. I do not moon, Bast. Chronicler picked up his flat leather satchel and produced a sheet of paper 3/4 full of small, precise writing. I can read the last bit back to you, if you'd like. Coate held out his hand. I can remember your cipher well enough to read it for myself, he said wearily. Give it over. Maybe it will prime the pump. He glanced over at Bast. "Come and sit if you're going to listen. I won't have you hovering." Bast scampered for a seat while Coate drew a deep breath and looked over the last page of yesterday's story. The innkeeper was quiet for a long moment. His mouth made something that might have been the beginning of a frown, then something like a faint shadow of a smile. He nodded thoughtfully, his eyes still on the page. "So much of my young life was spent trying to get to the university," he said. "I wanted to go there even before my troop was killed, before I knew the Chandrian were more than a campfire story, before I began searching for the Emir." The innkeeper leaned back in his chair, his weary expression fading, becoming thoughtful instead. "I thought once I was there, things would be easy. I would learn magic and find the answers to all my questions. I thought it would all be storybook simple." Kvothe gave a slightly embarrassed smile, the expression making his face look surprisingly young. "And it might have been, if I didn't have a talent for making enemies and borrowing trouble. All I wanted was to play my music, attend my classes, and find my answers. Everything I wanted was at the university. All I wanted was to stay." He nodded to himself. "That's where we should begin." The innkeeper handed the sheet of paper back to Chronicler, who absent-mindedly smoothed it down with one hand. Chronicler uncapped his ink and dipped his pen. Bast leaned forward eagerly, grinning like an excited child. Kvothe's bright eyes flickered around the room, taking everything in. He drew a deep breath and flashed a sudden smile, and for a brief moment looked nothing like an innkeeper at all. His eyes were sharp and bright, green as a blade of grass. "Ready?" Chapter 3. Luck. Every term at the university began the same way. The admissions lottery followed by a full span of interviews. They were a necessary evil of sorts. I don't doubt the process started sensibly. Back when the university was smaller, I could picture them as actual interviews, an opportunity for a student to have a conversation with the masters about what he had learned, a dialogue, a discussion. But these days, the university was host to over 1,000 students. There was no time for discussion. Instead, each student was subjected to a hail of questions in a handful of minutes. Brief as the interviews were, a single wrong answer or overlong hesitation could have a dramatic impact on your tuition. Before interviews, students studied obsessively. Afterward, they drank in celebration or to console themselves. Because of this, for the 11 days of admissions, most students looked anxious and exhausted at best. At worst, they wandered the university like shamblemen, hollow-eyed and gray-faced from too little sleep, too much drink, or both. Personally, I found it odd how seriously everyone else took the whole process. The vast majority of students were nobility or members of wealthy merchant families. For them, a high tuition was an inconvenience, leaving them less pocket money to spend on horses and whores. The stakes were higher for me. Once the masters set a tuition, it couldn't be changed. So if my tuition was set too high, I'd be barred from the university until I could pay. The first day of admissions always had a festival air about it. The admissions lottery took up the first half of the day, which meant the unlucky students who drew the earliest slots were forced to go through their interviews mere hours afterward. By the time I arrived, long lines snaked through the courtyard, while the students who had already drawn their tiles milled about, complaining and attempting to buy, sell, or trade their slots. I didn't see Willem or Simon anywhere, so I settled into the nearest line and tried not to think of how little I had in my purse, 1 talent and 3 jots. At one point in my life, it would have seemed like all the money in the world, but for tuition, it was nowhere near enough. There were carts scattered about selling sausages and chestnuts, hot cider and beer. I smelled warm bread and grease from a nearby cart. It was stacked with pork pies for the sort of people who could afford such things. The lottery was always held in the largest courtyard of the university. Most everyone called it the Pennant Square, though a few folk with longer memories referred to it as the Questioning Hall. I knew it by an even older name, the House of the Wind. I watched a few leaves tumble around the cobblestones, and when I looked up, I saw Fella staring back at me from where she stood 30 or 40 people closer to the front of the line. She gave me a warm smile and a wave. I waved back, and she left her place, strolling back to where I stood. Fella was beautiful, the sort of woman you would expect to see in a painting. Not the elaborate artificial beauty you often see among the nobility. Fella was natural and unself-conscious, with wide eyes and a full mouth that was constantly smiling. Here in the university, where men outnumbered women 10 to 1, she stood out like a horse in a sheepfold. "Do you mind if I wait with you?" she asked as she came to stand beside me. "I hate not having anyone to talk to." She smiled winsomely at the pair of men queued up behind me. "I'm not cutting in," she explained. "I'm just moving back." They had no objections, though their eyes flickered back and forth between Fella and myself. I could almost hear them wondering why one of the most lovely women in the university would give up her place in line to stand next to me. It was a fair question. I was curious myself. I moved aside to make space for her. We stood shoulder to shoulder for a moment, neither of us speaking. "What are you studying this term?" I asked. Fella brushed her hair back from her shoulder. "I'll keep up with my work in the archives, I suppose. Some chemistry, and Brander has invited me into manifold maths." I shivered a bit. Too many numbers. I can't swim those waters. Fella gave a shrug, and the long, dark curls of hair she'd brushed away took the opportunity to tumble back, framing her face. "It's not so hard once you get your head around it. It's more like a game than anything." She cocked her head at me. "What about you?" "Observation in the Medica," I said. "Study and work in the fishery. Sympathy, too, if Dahl will have me. I should probably brush up on my Siaru, too." "You speak Siaru?" she asked, sounding surprised. "I can get by," I said, "but Will says my grammar is embarrassingly bad." Fella nodded, then looked sideways at me, biting her lip. "Elodin's asked me to join his class, too," she said, her voice thick with apprehension. "Elodin's got a class?" I asked. "I didn't think they let him teach." "He's starting it this term," she said, giving me a curious look. "I thought you'd be in it. Didn't he sponsor you to Relar?" "He did," I said. "Oh." She looked uncomfortable, then quickly added, "He probably just hasn't asked you yet. Or he's planning on mentoring you separately." I waved her comment aside, though I was stung at the thought of being left out. "Who can say with Elodin?" I said. "If he isn't crazy, he's the best actor I've ever met." Fella started to say something, then looked around nervously and moved closer to me. Her shoulder brushed mine, and her curling hair tickled my ear as she quietly asked, "Did he really throw you off the roof of the crockery?" I gave an embarrassed chuckle. "That's a complicated story," I said, then changed the subject rather clumsily. "What's the name of his class?" She rubbed her forehead and gave a frustrated laugh. "I haven't the slightest idea. He said the name of the class was the name of the class." She looked at me. "What does that mean? When I go to ledgers and lists, will it be there under the name of the class?" I admitted I didn't know, and from there it was a short step to sharing Elodin's stories. Fella said a scriv had caught him naked in the archives. I'd heard that he'd once spent an entire span walking around the university blindfolded. Fella heard he'd invented an entire language from the ground up. I'd heard he had started a fistfight in one of the seedier local taverns because someone had insisted on saying the word utilize instead of use. "I heard that too," Fella said, laughing, "except it was at the Horse and Four, and it was a baronet who wouldn't stop using the word moreover." Before I knew it, we were at the front of the line. "Quoth, Arladen's son," I said. The bored-looking woman marked my name, and I drew a smooth ivory tile out of the black velvet bag. It read, Felling, noon. 8th day of admissions. Plenty of time to prepare. Fella drew her own tile, and we moved away from the table. What did you get? I asked. She showed me her own small ivory tile, kindling at 4th bell. It was an incredibly lucky draw, one of the latest slots available. Wow! Congratulations! Fella shrugged and slipped the tile into her pocket. It's all the same to me. I don't make a special point of studying. The more I prepare, the worse I do. It just makes me nervous. You should trade it away then, I said, gesturing to the milling throng of students. Someone would pay a full talent to get that slot. Maybe more. I'm not much for bargaining either, she said. I just assume whatever tile I draw is lucky and stick to it. Free from the line, we didn't have any excuse to stay together, but I was enjoying her company, and she didn't seem terribly eager to run off, so the two of us wandered the courtyard aimlessly, the crowd milling around us. I'm starving, Fella said suddenly. Do you want to go have an early lunch somewhere? I was painfully aware of how light my purse was. If I were any poorer, I'd have to put a rock in it to keep it from flapping in the breeze. My meals were free at Anchor's because I played music there, so spending money on food somewhere else, especially so close to admissions, would be absolute foolishness.
Пиздец, Тильда. Вот видишь, кстати, вот он дрон, блядь. Ты покидал настоящее. Вот у вас с Трефлом жесткие половые отношения. Ну а дрон это пиздец, типа это кидало, блядь, 1000 ранга. Без понятия, Зеровейв. Да ты кидала дрон, это конец карьеры. Зона прокма. Не знаю, Гигич не играю, блядь, час.
Replicator being delivered. Replicator entering orbit. Another soft landing.
Да эта игра будет плавно работать, меня так заебало это. Ну, давайте прямо, блядь, чего. Я ему ответил на вопрос, он, блядь, продолжает это спамить.